Let's start right away. I'd like to introduce my panel. So my name is Mirjam Wolfrum. I'm the Policy Director at CDP Europe. And today with me here on the panel is Sebastien Godinot. He's economist at the WWF European Policy Office and has worked for many years in the environmental sector, being an expert on public and private finance, subsidies and the green economy. And he has also followed substantially and closely the Non-Financial Reporting Directive and the wider sustainable finance agenda. And Phil Bloomer, Executive Director at the Business and European Rights Resource Center, tracking the human rights performance of over 7,000 companies around the world. Phil is also director of the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark that works with investors and ranks the largest companies in high-risk sectors regarding their human rights policy, practice, and performance. So I'm actually very happy, and let's to have these experts on climate and environment and business and human rights, which is a good sort of set of a focus into the wider topics covered by the Non-Financial Reporting Directive. And let me start with a question to you, Sebastien, and let me introduce it a little bit into the context. So I'd like to start with looking at the users of climate and environmental information and the key levers to drive mainstream disclosure and action within the economy. And I'd like to give you one example from CDP's work by what I mean by mainstream, and you might see this differently. CPR Asset Managers, who is a subsidiary of Amundi, Europe's largest asset manager, has just launched a new thematic equities fund based on CDP data that will drive investment in companies that meet or thrive to meet the well below 2 degrees global warming goal. So this corporate information is actually, for this financial product, for this fund, actually comes from voluntary corporate disclosure. So my question would be, what are the most important issues in the mandatory corporate reporting framework and then the NFRD that need improvement to leverage these financial market and to drive a sustainable financial system?
Thanks. I think the example you give actually answers largely the question. In our view, the key element is to improve the comparability of ESG data. This is what we hear from every single investor we are discussing with. They struggle like hell to use the ESG data and analysis in their investment process because this is too complex, this is fragmented, this is scattered, this is very difficult to use as of today. So comparability of ESG data is absolutely key, and this is what the review of the Non-Financial Reporting Directive should target, should aim for. And we believe it's now mature enough, it's now time to improve this comparability radically. What the technical expert group has proposed recently on climate disclosure is to have more specific climate indicators, building on the TCFD recommendations, more specific climate indicators to be integrated in the non-financial guidelines, and then we hope in the NFRD itself. And they propose a system in 3 layers of indicators. They must indicators, the should and the may. So in our view, the indicators that shall be reported by companies, mandatory indicators, then indicators that companies should report, and then indicators that company may report if they wish. So the mandatory, the recommended, and the suggested. And I believe if we have such set of indicators at sector-specific level, critically important, so that we can really compare the peers. No point in trying to compare companies in fully different sectors. If we are able with this approach to compare the peers, I think it strikes a very good balance between comparability and flexibility. And the example you gave is showing that you need to compare the companies in terms of key indicators. And this is now feasible in our view. For example, there are already heat maps available by different market players to assess which sectors are the most important ones on climate change. We know this now. We have scientific analysis for this. And I discussed this recently with Transparency International, with Clean Clothes Campaign, with different players, with banks, etc. We also know the most risky sectors globally in terms of human rights. And we know the most risky sectors in terms of tax evasion. And we know the most risky sectors in terms of biodiversity collapse. So we are able to have these heat maps and make sure for each sector we require mandatory indicators on the key issues, the most strategic issues for the business model of the companies in terms of negative impacts and, of course, in terms of maximizing positive impact. And the second element that you mentioned is to link this reporting to targets, sustainability targets at company level. What is important here is increasingly, now that we have the global targets that clear in the Paris Agreement on climate issues, and much more generally we have the SDGs for many ESG issues. We have the publicly agreed global targets. Now we need to make sure companies will integrate this in their own business models, set up their own corporate level targets, tailored targets for their own business model, and report annually against the achievement of these targets. And this will reconcile the public targets on public goods and the company's targets and the company reporting on ESG issues.
Thank you. I would definitely like to dig a little bit deeper into the sort of what we mean and understand by KPIs, and maybe also where might be some misunderstandings, and specifically when it does not come to emissions, which is the most mature part of this puzzle. But I think there's also questions on biodiversity and these things. But I'd like to now move to Phil, and I think we heard a lot about the human rights, and human rights diligence is often the first issue that comes up when talking about supply chains of global corporates. And the report finds that over 90% of companies express in their reports a commitment to respect human rights, and over 70% try to ensure the protection of human rights also in their supply chains. So that sounds very good. Can you talk a little bit about your vision and this model of change of reporting and ranking in that regard, and maybe also give us a bit of insight how effective it is for human rights?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's great to look at these figures on human rights because they're hugely indicative of a broader trend that we see in all the benchmarking that we're involved in, that the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark is involved in, which involves a lot of investors like Aviva and the Institute for Human Rights and Business, but also know the chain and many others. And the distribution is essentially represented in the answers to this. You've got 90% of companies report a commitment to human rights, and you've got 10% that show effective management of human rights risks. Okay? So that's the extraordinary breach that you have in the world, in the business world. And that's why benchmarks can be hugely helpful in, first of all, rewarding that 10% of companies by actually recognizing the efforts that they're making to manage the human rights risks in their operations and in their supply chains. And by the way, it should really be the 6% that also include managing risks in their supply chains, because that's where most of the risks of human rights abuse are. And it's not even in the first tier, it's often in the second and third tier of their supply chains. So it's that 6% or 10% that you need to really, that should be getting a massive reputation reward, should be getting investors really investing in them because they're managing those risks, and therefore we would be addressing to some extent the profound market failure that we see in terms of investors not investing in companies that are really looking after the planet, and also the market failure of companies that are not investing in and ensuring the essential human rights of the workers and the communities in their supply chains. But of course, the other aspect of this is it clearly demonstrates that there is also another aspect to this, which is regulation and incentives. Governments have a profound duty to make sure that they are upholding the essential standards of the societies that they represent. Most of the member states of Europe have signed up to many ILO protocols. Does their public procurement, in terms of buying products and services, really focus singularly on providing that public procurement only through companies that are actually essential, that are ensuring that they're managing those environmental and human rights risks? Not at all. The benchmark gives you the opportunity as a company, and the non-financial reporting directive, therefore, make sure that governments can also ensure that they've got regulation that lifts the minimum floor of corporate behaviour up from the profound negligence that is infested in most businesses, I'm afraid, from what you can see from these results, but also from the corporate human rights benchmark. But it also allows governments to make sure that there's a real incentive for companies that are seeking to do the right thing and at least managing those risks. It doesn't mean to say they're going to be able to get rid of them, but they're at least managing them, and they should be able to get that extra financial incentive from investors and from public procurement.
Thank you. I'm sure that Sebastien has also quite some strong views about benchmarks, but I'd like to dig a little bit deeper now into, because we have really sort of the experts, and I'd like to make this a little bit more concrete. When we talk about KPIs, and I think there's differences and challenges on both ends, but there's maybe even more unclarity when it comes to human rights and the S. So I'd love to get maybe some examples and some more explicit views on when you talk about KPIs for climate or environmental, can you give an example, and what do we mean? I mean, we have heard this many times today when we take the Paris Agreement, when we take a 1.5 and a 2 degrees global warming, and we know that every single company should actually meet this and help the society to meet this target. What is the KPI that the non-financial reporting directive needs to, and what is the elements maybe of this KPI? It's maybe not one single figure.
Yes, I'll focus on climate to make it as easy as possible. The KPI, the report, the indicators we have most commonly today on climate change is carbon footprinting, GHG emissions, scope 1 to 3 maybe, etc. The problem with this indicator is that it's backward-looking. It gives you the emissions of 2 years in the past, at best. And what does it tell you about the emissions of the company in the future? Nothing. What does it tell you about the alignment or potential alignment with the Paris Agreement? Nothing. So there is a major flaw with emissions, which is that it's not forward-looking, and it doesn't give you the degree of alignment with the already agreed global climate goal, which is the Paris Agreement. So we need something else, at least to complement, if not to replace carbon emissions, which is forward-looking forward-looking analysis of the degree of alignment of a company's business model with the Paris Agreement. And this is now technically feasible. I know it's more complex, it's more sophisticated, but it's much more meaningful and telling, especially for investors. Investors are wondering about future investments in tomorrow's economy. So having information on current emissions that are essentially a function of past investments doesn't mean anything for the future of the companies, because it's just something from the past. It's done, it happened, it's too late to change it to a large extent. You can refurbish, you can shut down a plant, but it's very limited. You need to focus on forward-looking issues. And this is now feasible, as I mentioned, to assess the degree of alignment of a company's business model with 2-degree scenario from the IEA, from the IPCC, for example, with a well below 2-degree scenario, with a 3-degree scenario, etc. Fossil fuel companies are already doing this for 10 years. This is not rocket science. It seems some people are still not aware of it, but this is already quite granular. There are already expert discussions, because fossil fuel companies are already creating their own in-house scenarios, and increasingly investors themselves and banks themselves are creating their own in-house long-term climate scenarios, and they're comparing with the IEA scenarios and the IPCC scenario, etc. So it becomes really feasible. There's already a lot of information out there. It should be standardized. In our view, there should be a requirement in terms of KPIs, a requirement for the most important sectors to report the degree of alignment of their business model with the Paris Agreement, which means with a well below 2-degree scenario, and ideally with a 1.5-degree scenario. These scenarios are already available. There are 2 extremely robust ones, very granular ones, from the IPCC and from the IEA. They should be used as reference scenarios. Then companies can develop their own in-house scenarios on top if they wish, and they should explain their own assumptions. But this is a bit secondary. This is feasible, so this is what we really should require in such regulations. And I clarify again, especially for the sectors that are the critical ones in terms of emissions. It's not really relevant to bother any single company about emissions if they are not critical for decarbonizing the economy as a whole. Let's focus on the 6 meta sectors that represent 90% of emissions in the entire economy. That will already be a major step forward, but we need to start these key sectors now.
Thank you. That was quite a good clear example. And indeed, there is a lot of metrics and methodologies that are very mature, already used by many companies. So also, despite some maybe not so hope-giving figures that we see in the report, there is also a lot already used and out. So I think the point that Tom made from Vodafone, there's a lot of business opportunities as well identified is maybe also very important to keep in mind. I wanted to ask you a bit more the same question, but I try to frame it a little bit differently. And I also wanted to pick up something that has been mentioned on the previous panel. There is obviously sort of the two sides of the coin, which is the impact of environment, climate, other social issues on the company, which is usually what investors want to see when they read the annual report of the company. But then there's also the impact of the company, vice versa. And at CDP, we think at this sort of as two sides, which is a cycle, and one drives the other, and this should be rather sort of all going together. So if you think of these two angles and maybe also bringing in a little bit the element of accountability, I think this is crucial, especially in a field where in human rights where this is a little bit underdeveloped. At least this is what I understand. Verification. Can you give us an example of, is there one great, wonderful KPI that can solve the issue?
Yes, of course. No. Unfortunately not, but there are clear KPIs. But I very much agree with what Seb said. You know, I mean, firstly, I disagree with the previous panel in some ways. Only certain members on it around the KPIs, and that's healthy. But the point is, I'll give you one great example of the way in which the extraordinary power of something like the Non-Financial Reporting Directive can be just squandered and lost. And that's by essentially doing what, to a degree, it's done, which was also the case with the Modern Slavery Act in the UK. And then I'll compare it with something that has had a real effect, which was the gender pay gap legislation in the UK. Okay? So if you want a really powerful mandatory transparency system, it's got to work on the basis of comparability, because it's got to generate that extraordinary breach that I spoke about earlier between putting massive reputation risk on laggards and providing significant reputation reward and financial reward for those companies that are doing the right thing. So if you're going to generate that comparability, you need standardisation of some of the evidence so you can compare it. You need also to ensure that there's supervision so that there is a genuine opportunity to do that comparison, i.e. you need a single list of companies that are supposed to report, and you need then a central registry run by an authoritative body that holds that information and that can be used by everybody and trusted by everybody. And you also need, I think, sanctions in the end if companies are not prepared to report in the way that you have expected them to do so. So look at the Modern Slavery Act. The Modern Slavery Act in the UK made errors in all those areas. There was not a single list. There was not a central registry. The civil society, including CORE and ourselves, have had to build that registry as civil society to make sure that there is a monitoring of who's reported and who's not, and the quality of the compliance statements. And there's no sanctions at all involved. Compare and contrast. Now, results, there would have been absolutely no results from the Modern Slavery Act, despite the fact that I welcome the Act. It would have not had any substantial impact if it wasn't for the efforts of civil society to make sure that there was comparison, and therefore the media could report on it. Now, compare and contrast that with the more recent piece from the UK. Sorry to mention the UK government again. I know it's sensitive. It's certainly sensitive for me. But compare and contrast that with the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap reporting had a specific list of companies, it had a central registry by the government, and it had specific indicators that you had to report on what was the gender pay gap in your company. The result, almost every company has reported. Only half of the companies have still reported on the Modern Slavery Act. Almost all the companies reported. Most of them actually did provide all those KPIs. It got massive media attention because the media could look at all that and do the comparison, and it's massively shifted a whole set of companies to start to address the gender pay gap. I rest my case in terms of what is going to make the biggest difference in mandatory transparency in the future.
Very well. I need to look at the time, and I'm wondering if we might actually, if we have questions, I would like to take 1 or 2 questions. There's one question over, yeah, please, in the middle. Can you please then say your name, your organization, and if the question goes to a specific panelist?
Hi, my name is Lieve Loet. I'm working for a European Affairs Office. I have no client mandate to ask the question, so I'm asking this personal question. It looks to me, I work a lot for insurance companies, and it looks to me we're looking here in need for a bigger framework, kind of a systemic mental framework to understand all what we are saying. If you look at the insurance sector, we have a pillar 1 where we think about understanding the risk and eventually qualifying the risk. The second pillar is the governance and how you manage the risk and how you manage the risk also forward-looking. And the third one is reporting. I mean, it seems that in this area we started the other way around. We first went to reporting, and now we see that there is need for the other 2 pillars. And I would like to have the reaction of the panelists on this framework, if this would be helpful in this area.
Yes, I can try to answer about this. You raise an important question that, of course, reporting is only, let's say, the visible part of companies' efforts to to reduce their financial risks, to improve their positive impacts, to reduce their negative impacts on people and planet. The problem is it is structured like this because the EU has different regulations, and they kind of put the different issues in different blocks. And when you discuss the NFRD itself, it's a reporting directive, and the Council is usually extremely opposed to discuss more than reporting because they say, oh, it's only about reporting. Of course, reporting is relevant to report something meaningful content-wise. So then that means it leads you to discussing another piece of regulation that can be, for example, due diligence or directed duties on ESG issues, which are an absolutely key issue for all companies. But this is not. This will unlikely be dealt with in the reporting directive and reporting regulations. So you need different pieces, and you need to articulate them smartly, which is a challenge. But I think it's going in the right direction. Well, there's still a lot of work on this. The key piece missing right now in the EU legislative framework is to clarify due diligence and directed duties obligations for companies on ESG issues, on negative impacts on people and planet especially.
Yeah, and all I'd say is that from at least one perspective, you can argue that mandatory transparency is a precursor to what we really need, which is mandatory due diligence. In the end, we are going to get the reporting and the kind of flexible reporting that Suzanne spoke about in the previous panel, when every company, not just Novo Nordisk, but every company knows that it's criminally liable if it's not looked at and really assessed and sought to manage its human rights and environmental risks. And so that's why the Loi de Vigilance in France is so fundamentally important as a progenitor of the kind of legislation that we really need if we're serious about ensuring that we're raising the minimum floor of corporate behaviour in the 2 most fundamental areas. And I do say this because I know also that there is a deep worry, and we should be profoundly worried, obviously about our own survival, as Sirpa originally said, but also about the rise of chauvinist nationalisms across Europe and outside. And unless we're prepared to talk to that fundamental issue about how our markets work and the profound collapse in public trust in global markets that's expressing itself, those fears, through the rise of chauvinist nationalisms across Europe. We will not be able to address that. And I believe that mandatory due diligence is one of the bold steps that European governments across Europe could take that would actually undercut a lot of the fear-mongering that is being generated by chauvinist nationalists.
Wonderful. Let's take this. I'm looking at the time, so we are, I think, exactly where we should land. And please join me in thanking the panelists for this very interesting discussion.